I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile to introduce an address by the head of state.
Señor Presidente.
President, Secretary General, Excellencies, it is my honor to present the statement by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Chile, Sebastián Piñera Echenique, who, from our capital in Santiago de Chile, will speak to the General Assembly in the general debate of the 76th session. Thank you very much, President.
Señor Presidente de la Asamblea.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen. We are living through times which will mark future generations for decades. Those of us today inaugurating this General Assembly have a mission to accomplish and a responsibility to these future generations. The decisions or shortcomings of today will define the path of humanity over the upcoming decades. We are in the middle of the most serious pandemic of the last 100 years. Alongside this, we have a climate crisis, a serious social and economic crisis, and the erosion of our democratic institutions. In addition, multilateralism is under pressure, and there is a need to reform our international architecture. However, we cannot sit weeping and wailing. Quite the contrary. What is needed is serene diagnosis and, above all, wisdom, willpower and courage to adopt the most efficient and urgent actions, which is what we need. President, despite the repeated warnings of the scientific community that pandemics were latent threats, the international community and states decided to ignore them. So the coronavirus pandemic took us by surprise, with no early warning mechanisms, no information sharing systems, with fragile health systems, even in the most developed nations, who were not always able to care for all the sick. And most serious of all, we were lacking vaccinations and medicines to combat COVID-19. The medical personnel in Chile and across the world stepped up without hesitation to work tirelessly to tackle this emergency, often putting their own lives at risk to save our lives. I wish to pay them heartfelt tribute for their selflessness and commitment, for their professionalism, perseverance and resilience. The pandemic showed us that when the forces of innovation, technology and creativity are deployed, we can achieve incredible results. In just 10 months, we went from facing a virus we had no information about to having a battery of safe, effective vaccines to combat it. This is an unprecedented achievement in the history of humanity. Let us remember that the vaccine against typhoid took over 130 years to be approved. The vaccines against tuberculosis and dengue arrived 45 and 110 years after the diseases appeared. We have certainly borne witness to a great triumph of science. However, this triumph contrasts with a political failure. Because whilst some countries have doses of vaccine enough to vaccinate their population several times over, there are countries which do not have vaccines or equipment to protect their population even at a minimum level. So this is a triumph of science, but it is also a failure of politics. In science, cooperation prevailed. In politics, individualism. In science, shared information won the day. In politics, reservations. In science, teamwork predominated. In politics, we saw isolated efforts. And we must learn lessons from this failure. The first lesson is humility. The world was suddenly brought to its knees by a microscopic enemy. The second lesson is solidarity, to assist and support the most vulnerable. The third is cooperation, which is indispensable to resolve global problems. And the fourth is the determination to listen to the voices of scientists and expert opinion. In Chile, implementing these principles, we have established a health protection network, which very early on allowed us to integrate the public and private health systems, to triple the number of intensive care beds available, and to care for the sick according to their needs, whatever their social security or socio-economic circumstances. We also swiftly broadened our diagnostic network, which now includes 180 laboratories, which can process almost 90,000 PCR tests daily, and over 21 million altogether. An essential pillar of our strategy was early identification of the most promising international laboratories, which were seeking and developing the necessary vaccines. We used scientific criteria and no political considerations, and a determination to conclude agreements and contracts swiftly so as to ensure the necessary vaccines to protect the lives and health of our whole population. Now, Chile, almost 90% of our target population is fully vaccinated in Chile, and we have already started vaccinating children and providing booster shots for vulnerable groups. We have also cooperated during the most critical points of the pandemic, when inputs were scarce, by donating medicines and part of our vaccine stock to help inoculate the medical personnel of other Latin American countries. In the same spirit, along with the World Health Organization and over 50 other countries, we are promoting a treaty for preparedness and response to future pandemics. Nobody can guarantee that these pandemics will not happen. However, we must guarantee that when this does happen, we will be better prepared. President, the pandemic has also caused an unprecedented economic and social crisis, which has led to great losses worldwide in incomes, in jobs, which have affected families, the bankruptcy of many businesses, especially small and medium businesses, and an increase in poverty, as well as shortages amongst the middle classes. The crisis has also meant that fiscal deficit and public and private debt have shot up, jeopardizing macroeconomic stability. These ills have hit the most vulnerable countries and sectors hardest, and particularly women, thus increasing the gender gap. Some of the causes of this situation already existed before the pandemic, for example, a trade war between major powers, an incipient rise in protectionism, and a weakening of free rules-based trade. This clear diagnosis means that it is indispensable for public policy decisions to be based on macroeconomic, fiscal and monetary policies which are responsible and serious, and we must continue to progress towards liberalising trade, incorporating the new technologies of the digital revolution, which will certainly make all the difference between those who are aboard the train of progress and those who watch it flash past from the station. The pandemic and the digital revolution have fed into one another. Progress in digital technology has certainly allowed us to tackle the pandemic better. For example, in Chile, it would be difficult to imagine how we would have faced this pandemic without recent progress in our country, such as digital hospitals, virtual police stations, or our Chile Atiende information website. The pandemic has also sped up the establishment of the digital society, which has drastically changed our ways of working, learning, informing ourselves, and interacting in society. These changes are here to stay. Chile is doing its utmost to catch this train of progress. To this end, we have concluded free trade treaties with countries which represent over 90% of the global GDP. This important network of integration, alongside years of fiscal and monetary responsibility, have allowed us to deliver the biggest social assistance package in the world during this pandemic, which represents 20% of our GDP. The social protection network we have built together has channeled over $35 billion in direct transfers, which has meant aid and relief for SMEs and for almost 16 million of the almost 20 million Chilean citizens. These measures have allowed us to return to pre-pandemic levels of economic activity and investment. Following a fall of 5.8% in our GDP last year, this year our economy will grow by around 10%. We have also managed to recover 1.9 million jobs, which represents 80% of the total jobs lost. President, the coronavirus pandemic has forced us to restrict freedoms and decree quarantines. But climate change has not been in quarantine. It continues to advance implacably, and more quickly and with more serious effects than we had expected. And worst of all, some of its consequences are already irreversible. Indeed, this is no longer about a climate change. We are facing a climate crisis. Science, through the report of the United Nations panel of experts, has spoken clearly and unequivocally. Our citizens are demanding as a moral imperative that we change the course of history. And technology is giving us the tools to avoid an environmental apocalypse. The time for diagnosis is over. Now is the time to act, with great determination and a clear sense of urgency. We have a historic responsibility to both present and future generations. We are the last generation who can prevent the current climate crisis becoming an environmental apocalypse. Chile is a small country which contributes less than 0.25% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But we are resolute in our determination to assume our responsibilities and make our contribution to this war against the climate crisis. To do that, we have accelerated our process of decarbonizing our energy matrix. By 2025, we will have closed 2/3 of our coal-fired plants, and by 2040, we hope to have closed 100% of them. Moreover, we are working to ensure that by 2030, 70% of our energy matrix will be based on clean, renewable energies. This figure will increase until it reaches almost 100% in 2050. As evidence of this desire and commitment, we wish to share with you that in 2021 we will have inaugurated more sun and wind energy capacity than we had inaugurated in the whole of our history. But it's not enough to reduce our carbon footprint. We must be more ambitious and ensure that our efforts to produce clean, renewable energy also crosses borders and helps other countries to meet their own decarbonisation goals. We are therefore deploying green hydrogen, which is clean, renewable energy, whose production makes the most of our geographical assets, the high and constant solar radiation of our deserts, and the strong and constant winds in Patagonia. Nature has therefore given us the potential to produce over 70 times the energy which we currently need, thus avoiding the release of millions and millions of tons of carbon dioxide every year. Green hydrogen is the energy of tomorrow, which in Chile we are producing today. In addition to these initiatives, I wish to highlight first the electrification of our public transport system. Santiago City is the city outside China with the greatest number of electric buses in the country. Secondly, the protection of oceans and biodiversity, including the first marine protected area in the high seas and a marine protected area in the Antarctic. Thirdly, protection of the forests, including the planting of over 230,000 hectares of forests in 10 years, particularly of native species. Fourthly, the circular economy, including banning the use of plastic bags and other plastic items. And above all, a change from a culture of waste to a culture of recycling. Each generation has its own challenge. Avoiding seeing the climate crisis becoming an environmental apocalypse is the mission of our generation. This is a question of life and death, because the survival of the human species on planet Earth is at stake. We must not forget that 99 out of every 100 species ever to have existed no longer exist today, and we do not wish to add the human species to this unhappy list. History, our children, our grandchildren, and future generations will judge us not on our good intentions, but on our actions and results in the face of this challenge. President, in recent years, democracies have undergone a constant and gradual process of deterioration. All the international indices reflect this deplorable situation. There is one diagnosis, but there are many reasons for it. In Latin America, as well as the endemic reasons of low economic growth, extensive poverty, inequality, corruption, state inefficiencies, we are also facing the coronavirus pandemic and other diseases which are equally toxic and lethal for democratic, peace-loving societies. Ills such as the virus of populism, the cancer of polarization, and the plague of political fragmentation. The virus of populism operates by promising demagogical and fantastical solutions it knows it cannot deliver on. And short-lived immediate satisfaction always ends up sacrificing the future and weakening progress, as well as weakening democratic institutions and the rule of law. Polarization leaves no room for agreements and compromises. This true cancer infects the social fabric. It infects our institutions and injects intolerance throughout society. Finally, fragmentation, which consists of a trend towards an identity politics and individual causes, or the causes of small groups, which makes it impossible to articulate and process any differing visions or social demands and hampers agreements and governability. In our region, a new threat to democracy has also arisen, not from the outside, but from within. For many years, the threats came from military or subversive actions to snatch power from legitimate, democratically elected authorities. Today, the main threat comes from democratically elected governments who initially enjoyed legitimacy and who maneuver to remain in power, who subjugate the independence of other state powers, who co-opt the organs responsible for overseeing electoral processes and often crush opposition, resulting in open illegitimacy in their power. 32 years ago, Chile saw an exemplary transition to democracy. Over these last 3 decades, we have achieved not only a recovery of our democracy, but also a high level of economic growth and human development, a decrease in poverty and inequality, whilst always upholding freedoms and human rights for all our citizens. However, Chile has not been immune from the threats I was mentioning earlier. The social upheavals of 2019 included legitimate social demands from our citizens, but there was also an irrational, uncommon and unacceptable wave of violence. Despite the difficulties and pursuant to our long and beautiful democratic tradition, Chile was able to channel this social upheaval and its legitimate demands through a peaceful, institutional, democratic process in line with our constitution and the rule of law. Because we absolutely believe that the cure for the above-mentioned ills consists of more and better democracy. Today, following a transparent participatory vote, there is a constitutional convention in Chile, which is made up with equal numbers of men and women and participation by representatives of our indigenous peoples. This convention will propose a new constitution to our citizens. This must be ratified or rejected by the citizens themselves through a vote, which will be clean, transparent and democratic. Most Chilean people hope that this convention will put forward a text for a new constitution which can improve and correct anything that needs changing, and can also incorporate greater equity and social justice, protect our freedoms, protect our republican tradition and the values of our society. President. Another challenge we are facing in the world is whether the current institutions constituting our international architecture have adjusted or not to the new global reality, and whether they do respond to current and future challenges or not. Ever since the current international bodies were created last century, the world has changed radically, and there has been a technological and digital revolution which drastically changed our ways of living, working, learning and relating. However, the backbone of the multilateral organizations has stagnated. International institutions currently require significant changes and a true recast to be adequate to today and the future. International organisations must combine two principles. First of all, the broadest possible participation to give them legitimacy. And secondly, a decision-making system which is not stymied by antagonism, vetoes, blocks, or which sometimes makes it difficult to reach consensus, although that is so important. We must find new mechanisms to achieve the right balance between these values. Multilateral action is essential to protect democracy and security across the world, to achieve development and the well-being of our peoples, to protect the environment and tackle pandemics. At the same time, public awareness of procedures, debates and decisions and clarity in appointing staff are necessary for transparent functioning of these institutions. Ultimately, there is no better policy than an enlightened public, and no better disinfectant than sunlight. I cannot conclude without a word about what the triumph of the Taliban regime means, particularly for women and girls, who will have to live beneath its yoke. President, Afghan society is facing very difficult times, but the women in Afghanistan are in a particularly dangerous situation. Right now, as we speak, there has been a return to power by those who in the recent past wished to prohibit women from education, to deny their basic rights and freedoms, people who considered that the world had to be a world of they wished to impose upon them forced marriages. They wanted to guarantee impunity for those guilty of sexual violence against women. Attacks upon women in Afghanistan are attacks against women across the world. And we cannot, the United Nations cannot, be aware of this and then sit back and watch, paralysed by bureaucratic restrictions or political divisions in the Security Council. We must unite to work to protect them and restore women their full freedoms and rights, because the cause of women in Afghanistan is a cause for the whole of humanity. I wish to conclude my words by expressing our satisfaction at the contributions that Chile has made with great efforts in recent times. For example, these contributions include our contribution to the Declaration of Human Rights, which is the cornerstone of our civilization, our active promotion of democracy, freedoms and human rights across the world. We are also proud of our contribution to protecting the Antarctic, which is the world's last bastion of pristine nature. We are proud of our protection of the oceans and our combat against climate change. We are proud as well of hosting over 70% of the world's astronomical observation capacity and being pioneers in research and development of the potential of green hydrogen, which is a clean energy which will be essential to combat and win the battle against the climate crisis. Chile is and will continue to be a free, welcoming nation with a noble soul and great solidarity, which will overcome difficulties and maintain its identity, thanks to the knowledge, moderation, mettle and courage of its people. Chile will continue to be a good country to be born, grow, build a family, work and grow old in a climate of liberty, justice and peace. And Chile will continue to honour all its international commitments and contribute to bequeath a better world to future generations. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Chile for the statement just made. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Moon Jae-in, President of the Republic of Korea. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.